With his heart racing, Braden stepped in front of Martin, facing his mother and saying, "You don't know anything about him, you're just talking like that because of your appearance." The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm golden light over the local park where the sound of sneakers squeaking against the pavement echoed amidst laughter. Braden and Martin were in their element, darting around the basketball court, their movements fluid and synchronized. The ball flew effortlessly from one to the other, each pass punctuated by playful banter. "Watch this, Bray," Martin exclaimed, his voice brimming with excitement. He dribbled the ball with expert precision, weaving through an imaginary defense, his grin wide. "I'm about to pull off the sickest shot you've ever seen," Braden laughed, his dark hair bouncing as he shook his head. "You always say that and then you miss. Just remember, it's all about technique, my friend." He playfully nudged Martin, who feigned offense. "Oh, please. You're just jealous because I'm the better player," Martin shot back, puffing out his chest in mock bravado. They both knew that while Martin was talented, Braden's strategic mind often gave him the edge in their friendly competition. As the game continued, their laughter rang out, a testament to their deep bond. They spent hours discussing everything from school projects to their favorite video games, oblivious to the world around them. It was a carefree moment that felt almost timeless. However, not far away, Mrs. Baker stood watching, her arms crossed tightly against her chest. The frown etched on her face deepened as she observed the boys. The sight of Martin with his baggy clothes and unkempt hair ignited a sense of unease within her. She couldn't shake off her assumptions about him, rooted in her prejudices and societal views. To her, Martin represented everything she feared could lead her son astray. "Braden," Mrs. Baker finally called out, her voice slicing through the laughter like a knife. The boys paused, and Braden's smile faltered as he turned to face her. "Can I have a word with you?" "Sure, Mom," he replied, a hint of uncertainty creeping into his tone. He glanced at Martin, who shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant. As Braden approached his mother, she lowered her voice, though her tone was still laced with concern. "I don't like this friendship of yours, Braden. I think Martin is a bad influence. Have you seen how he dresses and his background? It's not something I want associated with you." "Mom, that's not fair," Braden exclaimed, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "You don't know him. He's my best friend, and he's really smart. He helps me with my homework." Mrs. Baker waved her hand dismissively. "Your grades are slipping, Braden. I can't help but think it's because of him. You need to be careful who you spend your time with." Her words hung in the air, heavy and accusatory. Braden felt a sting at her words, but he didn't want to admit how much they affected him. He forced a smile, trying to deflect the tension. "I'll talk to him about studying more, okay? But he's not the problem, Mom, I promise." Mrs. Baker sighed, her brow furrowing deeper. "Just think about it, Braden. I want what's best for you." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving him standing there, torn between his loyalty to Martin and the unease that tugged at his heart. Later that day, as they sat on a bench overlooking the basketball court, Braden confided in Martin about his worries. The sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the scene. "Hey, Martin," Braden started, his voice low. "I've been struggling with my grades lately. I think my mom is worried it's because of you." Martin's expression shifted to one of concern. "What? That's ridiculous. You know I would never steer you in the wrong direction. We can study together if you want. I'll help you focus." Braden nodded, appreciating his friend's supportive nature. "I just hate that she thinks you're a bad influence. It's not true. You're the one who always pushes me to do better." "Maybe we can show her," Martin suggested, his eyes sparkling with a hint of mischief. "Let's ace that history project together." "Yeah, we'll show her that friendship can be a good thing," Braden replied, a smile returning to his face. But deep down, Braden couldn't shake the feeling that their friendship was under threat, and he wondered how far that threat would go in the days to come. Braden stepped into the house, the weight of the afternoon pressing heavily on his shoulders. The door creaked shut behind him, its sound echoing through the quiet hallway. He found his mother in the kitchen, her back turned as she rinsed dishes, the soft clinking of porcelain punctuating the stillness. Braden hesitated for a moment, gathering his thoughts before taking a deep breath and approaching her. "Mom," he began, feeling his heart race. "Can we talk?" Mrs. Baker turned, her expression shifting from mild surprise to a frown. "What is it, Braden? I'm busy," she replied curtly, drying her hands on a dish towel. "It's about Martin," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "I really don't think you understand him at all." Mrs. Baker crossed her arms, leaning against the counter. Understand him? Brayden, I know exactly what he is. That boy is a bad influence. I've seen the way he dresses, the friends he keeps. I just want what's best for you. Brayden felt a rush of frustration. You don't even know him. Just because he doesn't look like everyone else doesn't mean he's a bad person. He's my best friend. Best friend or not, Mrs. Baker interjected sharply, you need to focus on your studies. Your grades are slipping, and I can't have you wasting your potential on someone like him. Her words stung. Brayden clenched his fists, feeling a mix of anger and sadness. Martin encourages me. He helps me with my homework and pushes me to do better. You're blaming him for my grades, but that's not fair. Fair or not, I'm your mother, and I know what's best for you, she replied, her tone dismissive. I won't have you associating with someone who could drag you down. Drag me down. He's not the problem. Brayden's voice rose, filled with a frustration that had been building for weeks. You're the one who's judging him without knowing anything about him. Mrs. Baker's eyes narrowed, her jaw tightening. I'm not going to have this conversation again, Brayden. You need to make better choices. If your grades don't improve, we might have to reconsider your extracurricular activities. Just because he doesn't fit your idea of a good friend doesn't mean he's a bad influence, Brayden shot back, feeling the heat of the argument rising. He's an amazing person and you need to give him a chance. With that, he stormed out of the kitchen, leaving his mother staring after him, her expression a mix of disbelief and frustration. Brayden marched up the stairs, his heart pounding in his chest. He flopped onto his bed, burying his face in his pillow, overwhelmed by the weight of the argument. The next day, Brayden walked into school with a sinking feeling in his stomach. He had been trying to focus on his studies, but the tension between him and his mother loomed like a dark cloud. His mind wandered back to the conversation they had, and he felt the gnawing anxiety of his declining grades. During lunch, he found Martin sitting alone at their usual table, sketching in his notebook. Brayden approached, forcing a smile despite the heaviness in his heart. Hey, Martin, what's up? Just working on some ideas for my art project, Martin replied, glancing up. How about you? You look a bit off. Brayden sighed, taking a seat across from him. It's my mom. She is still on my case about you. She thinks you're a bad influence because of my grades. Martin frowned, his brow furrowing with concern. I didn't mean to cause any trouble. I just want to help. You're not the problem, Brayden insisted, trying to reassure him. She doesn't see how great you are. She just sees the surface. Just then, the bell rang, signaling the end of lunch. As they stood to leave, Brayden felt the unease settle back into his chest. He had to find a way to prove to his mother that Martin was a positive force in his life, but he didn't know how. As the day dragged on, Brayden found himself distracted during class, his mind racing with thoughts of his friendship and the looming confrontation with his mother. He couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to come to a head, and he hoped desperately that he could find a way to bridge the gap between them. Little did he know that the events unfolding would soon push them all to confront their beliefs and biases in ways they never anticipated. As Martin approached Brayden's house, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the neatly trimmed lawn. He clutched a small wrapped gift, a token of encouragement for his friend, hoping to lift Brayden's spirits as they struggled with their school projects. Unbeknownst to him, Mrs. Baker was watching from the living room window, her brow furrowed in disapproval. Look at him, she muttered under her breath, her arms crossed tightly against her chest. What kind of trouble is that boy bringing with him? She leaned closer to the glass, her heart racing with a mix of concern and suspicion. Martin's casual attire, a loose-fitting hoodie and baggy jeans only fueled her misguided notions about him. She watched as Martin knocked on the door, his smile brightening as Brayden opened it wide. The two friends exchanged excited chatter that resonated through the walls, but Mrs. Baker couldn't hear the joy in their voices, only the sound of impending trouble. She felt her stomach knotting as she decided to hide behind the curtain, a self-appointed guardian against what she perceived as a bad influence. Inside, Brayden and Martin were animated, sprawled across the living room floor with textbooks and notebooks scattered around them. You know, if we combine our ideas for the science project, we could totally ace it, Brayden exclaimed, his eyes gleaming with enthusiasm. Martin grinned, his confidence shining through. Absolutely, we can make a volcano that erupts with actual lava, well, sort of. Just some baking soda and vinegar will do. They both burst into laughter at the absurdity of their plan, oblivious to the tension brewing just outside. Suddenly, the door swung open and Mrs. Baker stormed into the room, her eyes blazing with anger. What is going on here? she demanded, her voice sharp and accusatory. Brayden looked up, startled, his smile fading as he instinctively shifted to protect his friend. Mom, we're just working on our project. Enough! I saw him at the door, Mrs. Baker interrupted, pointing an accusatory finger at Martin. What are you doing here? Are you trying to steal something? Martin's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. Miss Baker, I came to help Brayden study. I would never... Don't you dare lie to me, she snapped, her voice trembling with indignation. I can't believe you would bring this trouble into our home. You think I don't see what you're trying to do? Brayden stood up, his heart racing. Mom, stop. Martin isn't like that. He's my best friend, and he's just here to help me. Mrs. Baker's face was a mask of fury and prejudice. You think I'm going to let some kid off the street influence my son? I won't have it. You're a bad influence, Martin, and I won't let you ruin Brayden's future. Martin took a step back, hurt flashing across his features. I'm not a bad influence. You don't even know me. His voice cracked with emotion. I'm just trying to be a good friend. Good friends don't pull each other down. They lift each other up, Mrs. Baker replied coldly. And you're doing the opposite. I won't allow this friendship to continue. Brayden's heart sank as he watched the confrontation escalate. Mom, you're being unfair. You don't know anything about him. Unfair? She echoed, her tone icy. Do you think I want this for you? I'm protecting you from people who don't belong in our lives. Martin's eyes glistened with unshed tears, his hurt palpable. I'm not a criminal. I'm just a kid like you. I go to school. I get good grades. Enough. Mrs. Baker shouted, her patience wearing thin. Get out. I don't want you in my house. Brayden felt a surge of anger and desperation. Mom, please, you can't just treat him like this. You don't understand what you're doing. But Mrs. Baker remained resolute, her prejudices blinding her to the truth standing right before her. As Martin turned to leave, the air was thick with unresolved tension, an unspoken understanding that this moment would change everything for all three of them. Martin stood in the living room, his heart racing as he faced Mrs. Baker. The accusation hung heavily in the air, a weight that threatened to crush him. I can't believe you'd think that about me, he said, his voice trembling. Do I look like someone who would steal? I was wrong to accuse you without knowing who you really are. Martin looked up, surprise flickering in his eyes. You really mean that? He asked cautiously, still guarded. Yes, she affirmed, her voice trembling slightly. I didn't take the time to understand you. I let my prejudices cloud my judgment. Her gaze shifted away, focusing on a family photo on the wall, a reminder of the love and acceptance she had always wanted to instill in Brayden. Please come back. I can see now that you are a good influence on Brayden. Brayden stood quietly, his heart swelling with relief. He had hoped for this moment where the rift between his mother and his best friend could begin to heal. Martin, she really does mean it, he added, his voice earnest. You're my best friend. I want you to be part of our family. Martin hesitated, glancing back at Brayden. The warmth in his friend's eyes encouraged him, yet the sting of Mrs. Baker's earlier accusations still lingered. I appreciate it, Mrs. Baker. It's hard to forget what happened. I understand. It will take time, she replied, her tone softening. But I want to try. I want to learn. Martin nodded slowly, the wheels in his mind turning. Okay, I'll give it a chance, he said, his voice steadier now. But it's going to take more than just words. Actions matter. Absolutely, Mrs. Baker agreed, a hint of determination entering her voice. I promise to do better. You deserve that. Just then, the doorbell rang, cutting through the tension that had just begun to dissipate. Brayden's heart sank. He could see the worry etched on Martin's face. I'll get it, he said quickly, hoping to divert whatever attention was about to come their way. As he opened the door, a police officer stood on the porch, his uniform crisp and his expression serious. Good afternoon, the officer said, scanning the room with a practiced gaze. I need to speak with the residents of this house. Is there a problem? Brayden asked, his voice trembling slightly. The officer nodded. We received a report of a theft in the neighborhood. I'm here to ask some questions. His eyes landed on Martin, lingering just a moment too long. Mrs. Baker's stomach dropped. Memories of her earlier accusations rushed back, igniting a fire of anxiety within her. What kind of theft? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Some items were reported missing from a nearby home, the officer explained. We're just following up on leads. Can you tell me if this young man was here when the incident occurred? Braden's pulse quickened. He could feel the tension rising again. Martin was just here for a visit. He didn't do anything wrong, he exclaimed, stepping protectively in front of his friend. The officer raised an eyebrow, surprised by Braden's outburst. I'm just asking questions, son. It's standard procedure. But you don't understand, Braden insisted, his voice rising with emotion. Martin is my best friend. He didn't steal anything. He's not who you think he is. Martin, sensing Braden's distress, placed a hand on his shoulder. It's okay, Braden, he said softly. I'm used to being judged, but I want you to know I'm not a thief. I'm just here to support my friend. The officer studied both boys, the tension in the air palpable. I appreciate your honesty, he said, his tone softening slightly, but I still have to do my job. As the officer continued, Braden felt a knot in his stomach. He had fought so hard to defend Martin, and now, with the specter of suspicion looming over them once more, it felt like they were back at square one. As the door creaked open, the looming figure of the police officer filled the doorway, his uniform crisp and imposing against the backdrop of Braden's modest home. Mrs. Baker's heart sank as she recognized the familiar face, the weight of her earlier suspicions about Martin flooding back. Good evening, ma'am, the officer began, glancing at Braden and Martin, who stood side by side, their expressions a mix of confusion and concern. We received a report of a theft in the neighborhood. I need to ask a few questions. Mrs. Baker's face flushed with embarrassment and anxiety. What does this have to do with us? She stammered, her voice shaky. The officer's gaze shifted to Martin, who stood quietly, his shoulders tense. We're just following up on leads, he replied, his tone professional yet gentle. Your son's friend has been mentioned in connection with the incident. Martin, no, that's impossible, Braden exclaimed, his voice rising defensively. He would never do anything like that. The intensity in Braden's voice surprised even him, but he felt an overwhelming need to defend his friend against the unfounded accusations that had plagued them for days. The officer raised an eyebrow, intrigued by Braden's fervor. I understand, but we have to look into all possibilities. He turned to Mrs. Baker, who stood frozen, grappling with the implications of this situation. Can you tell me what you saw, ma'am? Mrs. Baker hesitated, her mind racing through the twisted path of her prejudices. She thought of Martin's appearance, the way he dressed, the stories she had convinced herself of. I just thought... She stammered, her voice trailing off as guilt washed over her. I thought he was a bad influence. Braden took a step forward, his eyes blazing with conviction. You thought wrong, Mom. Martin has always been there for me. He's the one who's helped me with my studies, not the other way around. You don't know him. You only see what you want to see. His words hung in the air like an electric charge, igniting a spark of realization in Mrs. Baker. Before she could respond, the doorbell rang again, this time with a sense of urgency. Braden's heart raced as he opened the door to reveal Martin's father, a distinguished man dressed in a tailored suit. Is Martin here? He asked, scanning the room before his gaze landed on his son, whose face broke into a relieved smile. Dad? Martin rushed forward, enveloping his father in a hug. The officer straightened, recognizing the man before him. Mr. Williams? He said, surprise punctuating his voice. I didn't realize you were connected to this situation. Yes, I just came to pick up my son. Martin's father replied, his demeanor calm but authoritative. What seems to be the problem? The officer explained the situation, the theft report, and the unwarranted suspicions directed toward Martin. As the officer spoke, Mrs. Baker felt her stomach twist in knots, her earlier biases crashing down around her. I'm so sorry, she finally managed to murmur, her voice barely above a whisper. Martin's father turned to Mrs. Baker, his eyes piercing yet understanding. I assure you, Martin is an exemplary student and a good person. He's not what you think. His words hit hard, and Mrs. Baker felt the weight of her past judgments pressing down on her. The officer, now fully aware of the gravity of the misunderstanding, nodded in agreement. We take these situations seriously, but I can see there's been a mistake. I apologize for any distress this may have caused. With that, he turned to leave, his posture more relaxed now that the tension had dissipated. As the door closed behind the officer, the room fell into an uneasy silence. Braden looked at his mother, a mix of disappointment and hope in his gaze. Mom, can we talk? He asked, his voice softer now, the fight having left him. Mrs. Baker took a deep breath, her heart heavy with regret. I need to apologize, not just to you, Brayden, but to you too, Martin. I let my fears cloud my judgment. I see now how wrong I was. Her words flowed out with sincerity, and Martin nodded, the hurt in his eyes beginning to fade. Thank you for saying that, he replied, his voice steady. It means a lot to me. I just want you to see that I'm not what you think. As they stood together, the weight of prejudice began to lift, replaced by a shared understanding that would shape their lives going forward. In that moment, the seeds of acceptance were sown, and Brayden realized that true friendship could bridge even the deepest divides.